The rain came sideways off the Chesapeake. That November, the kind of cold that doesn't argue, it simply wins. Sergeant First Class Caleb Rourke hadn't planned to stop. In the passenger seat of his truck, Duke lifted his head. Then he stood, which he never did on a moving road. Outside the entrance to a parking garage off Pratt Street in Baltimore, a man sat in a folding camp chair with a cardboard sign across his knees and a dog pressed against his left leg. The dog shaking, the man not moving, and a bruise along his jaw that hadn't been there yesterday, because nothing about the way it looked was yesterday's bruise. What Caleb Rourke uncovered over the next 3 weeks would expose a secret that had been buried for years behind the walls of one of the oldest estates on the Maryland waterfront. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe so you're here when the next one arrives. Caleb had joined at 22, with no particular ceremony about it. His older brother Danny had served. His father had served. It felt less like a decision and more like a direction his life had always been pointed. He did 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, ending his time overseas as a team leader in a unit that didn't advertise what it did. He came home to Baltimore in 2019 with all his limbs and most of himself. The part that was missing was harder to describe. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just that certain rooms felt smaller than they used to, and certain silences filled up too fast with things he hadn't asked to think about. He worked now as a security consultant, a word that meant different things to different clients, and he drove Duke to most of his calls because Duke was better at reading rooms than anyone Caleb had ever trained with. Duke was a Belgian Malinois, sable-coated with one ear that sat a little lower than the other, the result of an old training injury that had never fully resolved. He was 9 years old, which was getting on for the breed, and Caleb had quietly stopped letting himself think too far into the future. Duke knew when Caleb was awake at 2 in the morning. He would come and sit near the bed, not on it, just near, and stay until Caleb's breathing leveled out. He didn't need to be told. He just knew. The 2 of them had been operating as a unit for 6 years, and at this point the communication between them was less language than weather, felt before it was spoken. The man in the folding chair was named Raymond Holt. He was 73 years old. He had, at one point in his life, been the head groundskeeper at the Whitmore estate on the northern edge of the harbor, 38 acres of formal gardens and waterfront property that had been in the Whitmore family for 4 generations. He had worked there for 22 years. He had a daughter named Cecilia who lived in Phoenix. He had a wife named Margaret who had died of a stroke in 2017 and whose photograph he kept in a waterproof sleeve inside the lining of his jacket because he had learned in the first month on the street that anything not attached to your body could be taken. He had served in the Army from 1972 to 1977, infantry, and he had a discharge certificate that he also kept in the jacket, though he had stopped believing it would do him much good. He had been sitting in that particular spot outside the garage on Pratt Street for 11 days. Before that, he had been at a shelter on Calvert until the shelter had lost its funding and closed without notice. Before that, there had been a rooming house in Hampton where the landlord had raised the rent 3 times in 4 months. Before that, there had been a cousin in Towson who had offered a spare room with so many conditions attached that Raymond had quietly packed his bag on the 3rd morning and walked out without waking anyone. He had been moving since Margaret died. Not because he wanted to, because every door he had leaned against had eventually swung open into nothing. The dog pressed against his leg was named Chester, a 12-year-old beagle with clouded eyes and a gray muzzle, and the patient, settled temperament of a dog who had decided that wherever Raymond was, that was the right place to be. Chester ate what Raymond ate, slept where Raymond slept, and had been through every door with him since the rooming house in Hampton. Raymond had not once considered leaving Chester behind. The people who ran the shelters that didn't take animals could say whatever they needed to say. The collision setup was a parking garage and a November storm, and a dog in the passenger seat of a truck who refused to let the truck keep moving. Duke did not bark. He pressed his nose to the passenger window and made one short sound. Not alarm. Something else. Something that Caleb had heard in one other context and still thought about, and Caleb pulled over before he consciously decided to. He sat for a moment with the engine running, watching the man in the camp chair, watching the beagle. Raymond hadn't looked up. He was holding the cardboard sign across his knees with both hands, and his hands were the color of the sky. The bruise along his jaw was 4 or 5 days old at minimum, and the swelling under his right eye suggested it had company. Caleb got out of the truck. Raymond looked up slowly, the way a man looks up when he has learned to be careful about who is approaching. He assessed Caleb the way soldiers assess things, quickly, without moving his head. Then, he looked back at the sign. "I'm fine," Raymond said. Duke was already at the end of his leash, nose down, moving toward Chester with the careful economy of a dog who understood introductions. Chester lifted his head. His tail moved once. Duke sat down beside him without a word from Caleb. Caleb crouched to Raymond's level. He didn't know why, exactly. It was just the right thing to do with someone who had been looked down at for a long time. "How long have you been out here?" "I told you." "I'm fine. I heard you." Caleb glanced at the bruise. "You want to tell me about that?" Raymond turned his face slightly away. It was a practiced movement, not quite a flinch. Something older than a flinch. "Fell," he said. "Right." Caleb looked at the beak. "What's his name?" The question landed differently than the others. Raymond's posture shifted, fractionally, but it shifted. "Chester? How old?" 12. Good age." Caleb watched Duke settle his chin on Chester's back with such deliberate gentleness that it seemed almost choreographed. "Duke's 9. Starting to slow down." Raymond looked at Duke for the first time. Something moved behind his eyes. He pressed his lips together once. "Chester doesn't like strangers," he said. Apparently, he changed his mind. Raymond said nothing. His hands were still on the sign, but the grip was looser. It was at that moment that a tan sedan slowed on Pratt Street. Windows up, no turn signal, just slow, and Duke lifted his head from Chester's back. His ears came forward. The growl that followed was low and continuous, barely audible over the rain, and it wasn't directed at Raymond or Chester or anything in the immediate vicinity. It was directed at the car. Raymond's right hand had gone to Chester's collar. The movement was automatic, protective, and it told Caleb everything he needed to know about how long the tan sedan had been part of Raymond's life. Have you ever known someone like Raymond? Someone too proud to say they needed help, who would rather sit in the rain than ask the wrong person for anything. If that person is still in your life, call them after this. If they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. The car moved on. Duke did not relax immediately. He tracked it to the end of the block, watched it turn, then looked back at Caleb with an expression that was not quite neutral. Caleb filed it away. He got Raymond and Chester into the truck. This took longer than the conversation itself. Raymond had 3 reasons not to go, stated plainly, and Caleb dismantled each of them in the same voice he used when he was telling a client that their security plan had a hole in it. Not unkind, just factual. The 3rd reason collapsed when Chester stood up on his arthritic legs and put one paw on the truck's running board as though the discussion was settled. Raymond looked at Chester for a moment. Then he picked up his bag. Over coffee in a diner on Light Street, the surface of things began to come apart. Raymond had been employed at the Whitmore estate until 14 months ago. when he had been let go without explanation by the estate's current executor, a man named Graham Whitmore, nephew of the family patriarch, who had taken over management of the property following his uncle's death in 2021. Raymond had worked alongside the old man, Arthur Whitmore, for 2 decades. Arthur Whitmore had been the kind of man you found less and less of, particular about things, quiet about what he valued, and absolutely clear about the people he trusted. Raymond had been one of those people. What Raymond mentioned next, carefully, not looking up from his coffee, was that Arthur Whitmore had told him something during his final illness. Something about the property, something about a document that existed, and where it was, and what it said. Raymond had not looked for it after Arthur died because he had believed, at the time, that things would work themselves out through legitimate channels. Then Graham Whitmore had fired him. Then the lawyers had returned Raymond's letters unanswered. Then the legal aid office had told him the situation was outside their capacity. Then the rooming house in Hampton had raised the rent. Caleb listened without speaking. He asked 2 questions. He wrote one thing on a napkin, a name and a phone number, and slid it across the table. "That's a probate attorney I've worked with. Tell him I sent you." Raymond looked at the napkin without touching it. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb thought about that. He thought about a staff sergeant from Flint, Michigan, named Thomas DeWare, who had been part of his first rotation overseas and who had spent the last 2 years of his life unhoused in Detroit before dying of exposure in January 2022, and whose name Caleb had not spoken aloud to anyone since the funeral. He thought about the gap between who a man is and what can happen to him when no one is paying attention. "Because you served," he said, "and because it's cold." Duke, who had been lying under the table with his chin on Chester's back since they'd sat down, made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a statement. Raymond finally picked up the napkin. What happened next took 2.5 weeks. Caleb's attorney contact, a woman named Patricia Osai, pulled the estate records and found that Arthur Whitmore's most recent will, executed in 2020, 1 year before his death, had never been submitted to probate. The will that Graham Whitmore had filed with the court was dated 2016. Patricia made 3 calls and filed 2 motions before Graham Whitmore's attorney called her office. The conversation was brief. Patricia described it to Caleb afterward as a man who has been left alone too long with a story he started believing. The urgency arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a city variance application. Graham Whitmore had filed to rezone 32 of the estate's 38 acres for luxury residential development. The public comment period closed in 9 days. Once it closed, the development would proceed, and any claim on the original estate would become a claim against a construction site. Patricia worked through the weekend. Caleb drove to Annapolis twice. And somewhere in the Maryland State Archives, in a filing cabinet that had last been opened in 2020, there was a copy of a will that Arthur Whitmore had witnessed, signed, and had notarized by a woman in Towson who was still alive and still remembered the afternoon clearly. The will left the estate's primary residence and 6 surrounding acres to Raymond Holt, in trust. For the duration of his life, in recognition of 22 years of service, and more specifically, in fulfillment of a promise Arthur Whitmore had made to Raymond's wife Margaret the winter before she died, that Raymond would always have a home. There was a letter with the will. Arthur had written it by hand. It was 3 pages long, and Patricia read it aloud to Raymond in her office on a Friday afternoon, and Caleb sat in the chair by the window and looked at the harbor, and did not watch Raymond's face, because Raymond deserved that much privacy. The document was filed. The variance application was challenged on the grounds of the outstanding probate dispute. The development was paused. Graham Whitmore came to the estate on the following Wednesday. Caleb had been there since Monday. Patricia had advised Raymond to be present and visible on the property, and Caleb had suggested that visible might benefit from a specific kind of company. Raymond had been staying in the groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of the property, which was technically his under the will, and which had been unoccupied since his firing 14 months ago. He had spent 2 days cleaning it, quietly, with Chester at his feet, and the expression on his face while he did it was not joy exactly. It was something older than joy, something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed back in. Patricia was present. A neighbor from the adjacent property, a retired judge named Walter Spann, who had known Arthur Whitmore for 30 years, had come when Caleb called him. A young woman from Patricia's office named Denise was there as well, taking notes. Duke was at Caleb's left side. Chester was on Raymond's feet. Graham Whitmore arrived in a black SUV with a man Caleb identified immediately as private security, not military trained, not particularly well trained at all, but physically large and positioned with the specific purpose of making other people feel small. Graham himself was 61, well-dressed in the way of men who have never had to consider the cost of anything, and he walked into the cottage without knocking, as though the act of knocking had never occurred to him as a relevant social behavior. Duke entered aggressor mode the moment Graham Whitmore stepped through the door. The growl was low and continuous, not a bark, not a warning sound, a statement of position. Duke placed himself between Raymond's chair and the door without being told. When Graham took one step forward, Duke took one step forward. Graham stopped. Duke did not. Graham looked at the dog with the expression of a man deciding whether to be offended. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Raymond. "Ray," he said, using the shortened name with the deliberate familiarity of someone establishing hierarchy. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what this document means and what it entitles you to." Raymond looked at his hands. Graham continued, his voice taking on the smooth, patient tone of a man who has explained things to people he considers beneath him many times before. He described the 2016 will. He described the legal weight of the probate filing. He described, obliquely, the consequences of continuing to challenge documents that had been properly submitted to a court of law. He sounded reasonable. He had clearly practiced sounding reasonable. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Raymond said, "He hid my mail for 6 months." It came out quietly, not as an accusation, not as a performance, as a fact that had simply been waiting for the right room to be set in. 7 words. Graham Whitmore's face changed in a way that was not subtle. The private security man behind him shifted his weight. Walter Spann made a sound that was not quite a word. Duke did not move. Caleb spoke for the first time since Graham had entered. His voice was level. The vocabulary of a man trained to remain level in situations where the cost of losing control is measured in something more permanent than embarrassment. He described the 2020 will and its location. He described Patricia's filings. He described the dates of the mail that had been intercepted. Raymond had kept track, the way a man keeps track of things when he suspects no one else will, and what those dates corresponded to in terms of the legal notifications Raymond should have received following Arthur Whitmore's death. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply described what had happened and what was going to happen next, in the same tone of voice he might use to describe a structural flaw in a building. Graham Whitmore looked at the door, then at Caleb, then, once, at Raymond. The authority he had carried into the room had not survived the 7 words. "You'll hear from my attorney," he said. He said it to the middle distance rather than to anyone in particular. "Patricia Osei is mine. Caleb said. I believe you already have her number. Graham left. The private security man followed. Duke watched them go, watched the door, watched the window, and did not lower his head until the sound of the SUV on the gravel drive had faded completely. Then he walked back to Raymond's chair and sat down. Chester put one paw on Raymond's knee. What happened in the following weeks is the kind of thing that spreads through a neighborhood quietly. In conversations at the marina, in the coffee shop on Falls Road, in the way that Walter Spann told the story to 4 people, and each of those people told it to 3 more. The 2020 will was admitted to probate. The rezoning application was withdrawn. Graham Whitmore's attorneys sent a letter proposing a settlement that Patricia described, with professional understatement, as an acknowledgement of reality. Raymond declined to pursue further legal action beyond what was necessary to secure the estate. He was not a man who confused justice with punishment. The groundskeeper's cottage sat at the edge of 6 acres of waterfront grounds that had been maintained to Arthur Whitmore's exacting standards and then left alone for 14 months. Raymond started working them in December, in the cold, slowly, with Chester following in his footsteps and Duke watching from the porch with the patient attention of a dog who has decided this is where he lives now. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like arrangement, and the arrangement that had placed Raymond on Pratt Street on the exact evening Caleb Rourke happened to drive past, with a dog in the passenger seat who had seen things no amount of training fully explains, was one of those moments. Caleb spent Thanksgiving at the cottage. Patricia came. Walter Spann came with his wife. Denise from the office brought her daughter. Raymond cooked a meal the way he had cooked every Sunday meal for 22 years on that property, carefully, from memory, with music playing in the background and Chester stationed hopefully near the stove, and Duke stationed even more hopefully near Caleb's plate. The table was too small for everyone, so they used the porch despite the cold, with a kerosene heater at the corner and blankets on the backs of the chairs, and the harbor visible beyond the tree line in the late afternoon light. Caleb drove home that evening, with Duke asleep across the back seat. He sat in the parking garage on Pratt Street for a few minutes on the way, not for any particular reason, just to sit. The camp chair was gone. The folding chair Raymond had spent 11 nights in was gone. The rain had stopped. What Caleb Rourke did that November was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean the word. He had the same 24 hours anyone else had. Duke had told him something, and he had listened, and he had not driven past. This story is for every veteran living quietly through something no one has asked about yet, and for anyone who has chosen, even once, not to look away. Is there someone in your life like Raymond, a veteran, a parent, a neighbor you've been meaning to check on? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Let's fill this section with people who deserve to be remembered. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.